Hello and welcome from Buenos Aires, Argentina to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where Nate has conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those that have some connection to Latin America. My name is Josefina Dominguez and I am an editor for LatimList, a proud sponsor of the Crossing Borders podcast. Sign up for our weekly updates on latimlist.com to get a summary of the week's biggest headlines in Latin American tech news. Nate's guest today is Nico Barawid, co-founder and CEO of Casai, an emerging market hospitality brand that offers luxurious and intelligent living spaces. They talk about Nico's trajectory and how he ended up launching a tech startup in Mexico, having grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, and with a background in public policy and climate change. They also discuss the lessons he learned in consulting and in working at a startup before founding his own business, as well as how the customer persona for Kasai has changed with the pandemic. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Nico Barawid.
Hey, Nico, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thank you for having me on. Nathan, your name looms large in the Latin American ecosystem, and so it's an honor to chat.
Thanks.
Especially among gringos starting companies.
Yeah, there's quite a few of us now, aren't there?
It's true.
So tell me a little bit about Kasai. What are you up to?
Yeah, sure. So I'll back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about how we started, and then that'll kind of play into what we're doing. So I moved to Mexico City from San Francisco, the Bay Area, a couple of years ago now. When I was in San Francisco, I was working at a startup, and I was the first business hire after the startup Nova Credit left YC, and so I was got the sort of early stage spirit then. And my most recent gig when I was there was leading international expansion at that startup, and so I was traveling a ton for work. But unlike when I was a management consultant, I was always staying at Airbnbs because, seed stage travel budget. I found that while I enjoyed a lot the experience of staying in Airbnbs, I was consistently let down by the quality. So, sometimes there wouldn't be any Wi-Fi, or a lot of times there'd be, a toilet that I couldn't use for 3 days. And so I became obsessed with this idea of finding a better way to travel. But of course, as I mentioned, I'm a gringo and I have no experience in hospitality. And so I randomly met my co-founder, Mari Carmen, at a carne asada in Mexico City. And we started, thinking about how could we use technology to transform the hospitality sector. She was an executive at one of Mexico's largest hotel operators, and I was, just a passionate kind of consumer and had always had wanderlust. And so we started Casai, which is Casa Inteligente, and what we are is we're an emerging markets hospitality brand. We are offering beautiful and, importantly, intelligent living spaces with a standard of excellence that includes, luxurious amenities, locally sourced design, and that smart technology piece that I mentioned. And really, what the core of what we're building is if we could build a hospitality concept from scratch today, not being tethered to, hotels or Airbnbs or anything like that, what would it look like? And so we're building Kasai with a nomadic generation in mind.
Well, you're talking to somebody who was part of the nomadic generation before COVID.
It became cool.
Yeah, from basically like 2015 until COVID, I was staying in hotels, Airbnbs, long-term stuff all across Colombia, Chile, Mexico for about 5 years. And the problem you're describing is totally right. It took me, probably 3 or 4 trips to each place to find the one Airbnb that actually had everything that I wanted, instead of, not having soap or not having Wi-Fi or whatever it might be. So I can definitely see the need for that.
And one thing too that you will deeply empathize with is that what I found, traveling the world, is that the variability, especially is particularly high in emerging markets and especially in Latin America. And so what I mean by that is you can have the most amazing villa in the Dominican Republic with a private chef that you find on Airbnb, but then you can also find, and this was actually one of the experiences that led me to start Kasai, like, a very well-rated Airbnb in Miraflores in Lima that then like just doesn't at all look like the pictures, or you can't work in it, or the internet is super slow. And so that variability was something that I really wanted to standardize.
Yeah, you'll laugh at this, but when we did our Magma Summit in 2019 in Mexico City, we ended up the same weekend as the F1 races, so there wasn't a lot of stuff, and we ended up in an Airbnb that was highly rated, very good location. Photos were nice, but and I didn't go there the first night. The rest of my team went there the first night, and they were sending me these photos, and they were like terrified. And it was just, we ended up staying there for the week, but it was not a good experience to start. It ended up being a great experience, and we still talk about it to this day. But like, it would have been a lot nicer if it would have been exactly what we had wanted.
And that weekend, the F1 weekend is in Mexico City, traditionally the highest hotel occupancy weekend. And so, as you say, like universally is 100% occupancy. And so, unless you're planning like months in advance, it can be very challenging to get. Actually, a similar story was that one time I was going to a conference in Bangkok for the CEO, Misha of Nova Credit, and me, and I showed up on a flight a few hours before him. And I showed up and there was no Wi-Fi. And so I messaged the host and I was like, oh, like, where's the Wi-Fi code? And she said, oh, I didn't put that there was Wi-Fi on the listing. So why would you expect that there's Wi-Fi? And I thought to myself, I don't think I've ever checked if the listing had Wi-Fi. I thought it was just, included. And I thought, oh God, I can't do this. And so I had to like text the CEO who's on a flight, like, okay, I'm going to book us a hotel, but don't worry, I got everything fine.
Yeah, it's always a mess. Well, we're going to jump more into the business in a bit here, but I wanted to go back to your story. I read your LinkedIn post where you kind of talked a little bit about your background. Where are you from originally?
My family is Filipino. I was born in Cebu, but then I moved to the U.S. when I was 1, and so very much consider myself an American. Grew up in the United States for 30 years. And I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And then after college, I moved to San Francisco for 5 years before moving to Mexico City.
And what did you end up studying when you were in school?
I studied economics at Yale, where I went to college, and with a focus on government policy and specifically climate change. And then I went to graduate school at Oxford, where I studied public policy and climate change policy.
And how did you decide to get into tech compared to anything else you could be doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. In some ways, it almost felt inevitable, right? Like, people around our age all somehow find themselves into tech. And part of that is that tech is the economy. So it's like, how did you find a job in the economy? But the specific story of how I made my way to the Bay Area was that, as I mentioned, I studied climate change policy. And after consulting, I moved to the Bay Area to work at a large solar energy developer where I was doing project finance. So I was financing solar PV. I felt I was the only person in San Francisco that wasn't in tech. And so I was really intrigued by, I think, kind of the lightning pace of innovation and how things were going. I think I was less kind of starry-eyed about the riches that were there, and more about the impact that technology had in Facebook's case, billions of people. But I really wanted to have that social impact bent, and so my first job in tech was at this company that I said called Nova Credit, which is a fintech company that's helping immigrants and newcomers to the U.S. Access better credit.
And so, what were some of the biggest lessons you learned from both the consulting background and then the startup background that are helping you today to build your own business?
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is I read one of the piece. I think it was your most recent piece about how privileged founders can access capital much more easily. And so the first thing I want to recognize is that I am like very much a privileged founder, and so I just want to start with that. But I think I'll start with consulting, which is a big part of consulting is the storytelling piece and being able to pull together really disparate data sources to have a compelling storyline around what is the solution to the problem that you're hired to solve, right? And I think that actually carries through a lot of what I do today. Meaning that when I'm convincing investors to give me $50 million, or I am convincing this high-flying executive that has had a fantastic career for 15 years to come work for me with nothing, that storytelling piece is really, really crucial. I think it's both storytelling in addition to being able to back up what I'm saying with numbers, and so I appreciated that. And then what's funny about my transition to an early stage startup is that in many ways, I learned the ropes of entrepreneurship on someone else's dime, right? So like, as I mentioned, I was a third or fourth hire at Nova. And in the same way that I had my own ups and downs when I started Kasai, I saw how Misha and Nikki, the founders, had their ups and downs and how we iterated on things like all hands meetings and communications policies and the list goes on. And so I started Kasai with a much better understanding of what I wanted to work in terms of culture, in terms of traditions, et cetera, than if I had just come straight from BCG.
And a lot of people ask about how they should get into starting a startup. And my advice a lot of times is, hey, go work for a startup as an early employee, which was your path. Is that the advice that you give to people who are asking you, or what do you tell people that when they're talking about maybe starting a company in Latin America?
That's exactly what I say. And in fact, I was catching up with Misha yesterday, the CEO of Nova. And I told him, because I've been saying this for the last couple of years, like go learn entrepreneurship on someone else's dime. And I was like, just so you know, I say this. and he totally agrees, because in many ways, like, so when I joined Nova, I had this kind of vague title of, and what that meant was like run the business side of the company, right? And that was everything from HR. So it was like at one point we wanted to have 401ks for our employees to, as I mentioned, international expansion for the company. And especially as early as I was, we didn't have resources, right? Like now, if you go join, a Series D company, you can come in with a full team. But that having to figure stuff out, that having to be really scrappy without resources, the importance of culture that early, I think are learnings that you can kind of stumble upon if you do a startup for the first time when you're starting, but really show the importance of what that is. And another thing, which is not to be underestimated, was I did not come from a tech background, as I mentioned. And so I had no idea how product and engineering worked, or how the product team worked with the sales team. And so like both building that and seeing all of that fit together really gave me a running start when I started the company.
And the experience of somebody coming to learn how to do a startup on and get paid for it on someone else's time is going to be a variable experience if you're working for really good founders versus people that maybe aren't quite as good. How did you think about that? And what advice would you give to people on how to pick the company to join?
I think it's variable, but I think the learnings are still going to be there regardless. So if you work with people that you don't want to emulate, that's a learning. Or if you work with people that you really admire and want to bring and whose footprint you want to bring to your own company, that's also a learning, right? And so I think that obviously you can't pick the winners, but regardless, you're going to learn. And so I think especially for any kind of budding entrepreneur, like going to an early stage startup is very much the way to go if you want to fast track, your kind of entrepreneurial MBA, as it were. But that said, I was very kind of data-driven, strategic about the company that I would join, because as you say, it's high risk, and in particular, speaking specifically about financial upside, you get the same risk as the founders because you're so early, but then a very, very small fraction of the upside. And so, that does make it incumbent on the employee to really do the same kinds of analyses that VCs would do actually on those startups, right? So like those startups have no data, and so a lot of what I would advise is, evaluate the founders like a VC would, evaluate the addressable market like a VC would. And while you can't predict with 100% certainty success, at least you can kind of maximize the probability of upside.
It's a really good point. I think some of my biggest lessons learned were working as a consultant for a startup back when I was just graduating university, and they ended up doing basically everything you would never want to do in a startup. With, they had a private jet and they had a corporate condo.
Oh my God.
And they ended up, the CEO was, and other people were taking money, and it was just a mess. So you get to see like literally never do any of this from close up.
Right. And then it taught you the importance of like very strong ethics. Right. And so, it didn't work, but you walked away with a strong set of learnings.
It's true. So let's jump into Kasai a bit more. We talked a little bit about the problem. Why Mexico? Why Mexico instead of anywhere else in the world to start this?
Mexico is one of the largest tourism markets globally. In 2019, it was the 7th most visited country in the world, according to the UN World Trade Organization. In addition to the fact that it was the most visited, also, or one of the most visited, tourism also accounts for 1/3 of the GDP of Mexico, which means that there's a lot of both excitement in Mexican society for innovative hospitality companies, in addition to support for what we're doing, which is super exciting. In addition to that, Mexico has such a vibrant culture, both like urban in Mexico City and also leisure, in Tulum, as is now becoming the kind of playground in the COVID era. And so all of the macro factors were there for us to build a really massive business, just considering Mexico. In addition to that, what I find so amazing about Mexico is that the quality of talent, both business talent and engineering talent, is among the best I've ever seen, to the point where, people, the smartest people in Mexico often go en masse to the United States for opportunities, especially in technology. And so I wanted to build kind of a homegrown company where people could be proud and say, I am an engineer that's highly educated that went to Tec de Monterrey, but I'm going to like help build Kasai. And so there are lots of reasons that Mexico made a ton of sense. And also personally, I love Mexico City. I had been to Mexico City maybe 10 times before moving here. And it was in part that love for the city that I wanted to somehow be able to share with others through building a concept like Kasai.
I think that's one of my favorite parts about the tech revolution that's happening in LATAM right now, is that it's stopping or slowing down the brain drain. There's, with remote work and with the ability to build world-class companies locally, it's not forcing those people that maybe went to the US or to Europe before. They're able to stay and work on what they want to and not leave their family, culture, the food they love, all of that.
Yeah, and I'll give you a couple examples from Kasai that point specifically to that. So our CTO, his name is Andres Paez. He went to college in Mexico, but then went to the US to go work as a software engineer for several years, first for Amazon, then for Google. He was for a while a machine learning engineer at Google Search. He is exactly the kind of person that Mexico was losing, because someone of his caliber could only find opportunities in Mexico. And then I called him and said, hey, I'm building this concept. Would you want to come and be the CTO? And he said, this is amazing. I would love to do this. I've actually been thinking of moving my family back to Mexico. He has a baby girl, but didn't want to give up on the kind of caliber of problem or people that he was working with and on. And so moved back to be our CTO. And then another example is that our chief revenue officer, Alberto, also went to college in Mexico, went to business school in the US at Stanford, and then was at McKinsey. And two, it was the same thing on the business side. And I highlight this because it's both engineering and business, where he, for the caliber of talent that he is, was so excited to be running a homegrown company. And so there are many, many, many examples like that of people who now are able to find the opportunities that companies like Kasai are bringing in Mexico, and not just, in the Bay Area or New York.
So talk a little bit about getting Kasai off the ground. What were some of the first steps that you took to start building the business?
Yeah. Our first apartment in Mexico City in Roma Norte, my co-founder and I built with our own personal balance sheet. So we rented an apartment ourselves, put in our own furniture ourselves, listed it, took our own pictures, and then listed it on Airbnb. And we did that because before going out for financing, we wanted to see, was this a workable business model? Like, could we do all steps of the process? And then when we put it on Airbnb, we said, like, would someone want this kind of high-end experience? We got a reservation literally the same day that we listed it, actually from a local celebrity. And that showed us a few things. One was that operationally, it would obviously get much more difficult, but that we could do it. And second, that there was a high degree of demand for our product. And so we actually only had that data point. And then, a fancy presentation, PowerPoint presentation that I had when I went out for financing. And really, as I mentioned, our investors at that point, Monashis and Kasek, who split the round, were investing in my co-founder and me, since we had one unit and like 10 pages on PowerPoint. It was at that moment that we knew exactly what our kind of goals were post-seed, which were, again, we had abstracted away the customer acquisition concerns because Airbnb existed. We could get 100% occupancy just relying on Airbnb. And so the question for us was, could we grow on our supply side? Could we convince landlords and real estate developers to work with us and grow at scale? And those were the sort of first steps that we took in the first few months of the business, in addition to building the technology platform to power all of it.
So you mentioned the capital raise, and in addition, you've raised other capital and very successfully from an early stage in LATAM. Kind of, I think, on one of the earliest kind of the new wave of companies that kind of started this new boom here that we're seeing. Talk a little bit about the strategy for raising and what it was like first with the LATAM funds, and then growing into some of the US funds.
Yeah. The caveat I'll mention again is, I totally recognize that a lot of my ability to fundraise was based on my privilege. Like, I did have a fancy background, went to fancy schools, like worked at fancy companies. And so while I am very excited about what's happening now, I think what's happening now is the recipient of the largesse that we're seeing for Latin American startups are primarily going to privileged founders, as you exactly wrote in your piece. But when I was moving from the Bay Area to Latin America, all of my connections were in the Bay Area, right? And so for me, it was important, both with my co-founder and then also with my early cap table, to have local market expertise. And so I intentionally did not go to Sand Hill Road and try to raise seed capital from Silicon Valley investors. And so that's how, I started trying to understand the Mexican VC ecosystem, the broader regional VC ecosystem. And so I had a few conversations with Monashis and Kasek, and were obsessed with their kind of operational expertise in the case of Kasek. And also their ability to like see what works for kind of US and European models in Latin America and what doesn't. And so for me, it was very important to have that expertise on my side early.
Yeah, and at least from my perspective, my view on whether you're elite status or background or whatever, or underestimated, it's all good. I mean, there's nothing to feel bad about of being able to raise capital. And it actually is kind of paving the way, getting I think the US VCs more comfortable with the region. And that's been the story that I've heard from VCs, is that they'll invest in somebody they know or a background that they can check on. And then once they're in the region, they start meeting everybody else. And that's what leads to lots and lots more funding opportunities. So I think it's just a matter of time before more money starts to flow into some of the more underestimated founders early. But yeah, I mean, I think it's great. I mean, it's a really, really good thing for the region.
And you know what I think is going to happen, which is why, again, like I fully recognize my privilege, but I'm excited about what is happening, is that I would say, whereas Brazil is like in the second or third wave of the kind of VC cycles, I think Mexico is probably at the tail end of the first wave, where these really, really big names and rounds are, at the Series A stage, right? Or, in the case of Kavak, Series D and E. But my hope is that for all of these companies, so for Runa, for Kavak, I mean, it happened with Linio already, for Sophia Salud, all of these companies who were able to raise from names on Sand Hill Road, their alumni who might not have otherwise merited a look among large global investors will now be, and that these mafias will be created that then expands access to capital. And I think that is the best thing that could happen for the ecosystem.
100%. And that's already happening, right? You're seeing it with Rappi, with Corner Shop, with
right.
A whole bunch of the Brazilian companies. And I think it's just a matter of time. And it's a good part of the cycle in the ecosystem.
Right.
So you've raised some money, you've got a couple of apartments, and it's starting to run. What are the next steps that you took to get it to, let's go up to pre-COVID? What happened there?
Yeah. As I mentioned, the big question on our side was also, I think there's loud police in the background, but hashtag Mexico City.
Yeah, no worries.
But anyway.
That's normal. We've had mariachis in the background. We've had the colchones person in the background.
It's just part of the charm.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned, after our seed round, we were very clear that what we needed to do was prove our ability to grow on the supply side. We did. We ended up working much earlier on than even our wildest ambitions, working with very sophisticated and large real estate players in Mexico. And in fact, as you know very well, in Latin America, much of the real estate is controlled by a few small families. And we had already, quote unquote, credentialized ourselves with them because we proved that we could operate their assets very well. And so we ended up being able to tell a pretty compelling story for, okay, well, now we've proven that we have good demand side traction. We've proven that we can work with the biggest names in real estate on the supply side. Now let's expand this to many, many geographies. And so I remember in January 2020, our board meeting where I presented these kind of outrageous numbers to our investors. And I said, we're going to be in many countries by the end of the year, and we're going to grow super fast. And they said, oh, maybe instead of 10x growth, try 7x growth, right? Like that was our mindset in January 2020. And of course, that didn't happen.
So what was it like being a travel and hospitality company with COVID and with Mexico?
Oh, it was the most fun thing ever, I'll tell you, Nathan. It was, I did not get an MBA, but this was very much my MBA. It was very, very humbling and also eye-opening in terms of the resilience, both of the team and also of the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem. So what happened? So there's one specific day in our data where everything fell apart, and that was when the WTO the WHO declared everything a pandemic, and when that was around, I think like a day or two after that was when Donald Trump shut down travel to Europe, and it was that couple of days when our cancellations started outstripping our confirmations, and all of our numbers nosedived. And so I think there was a couple of weeks that was maybe more, maybe a month, that was just fog of confusion. You know, what's happening? How do we put our arms around everything? And then after my kind of woe is me phase that involved a lot of whiskey, you know, we just sort of got our act together and said we have no other choice but to make the best of this. And what was interesting was that we did still have people coming. And so it was incumbent on us to figure out who was still coming, right? And how to try to get more of them. So specifically, for example, our customer profile before COVID, so in February of 2020 was, you know, trendy New Yorker who had heard of Mexico City's like culinary scene that was coming for the weekend. And now it was more, we had a few different personas. One was, you know, diplomats who had no choice but to stay. One was stranded executives for companies like infrastructure companies that whose projects were still going to continue being built. And so we had a few discrete profiles. And so we kind of rapidly organized ourselves around finding out who these people were, figuring out what they wanted in their accommodation, how they booked and found out about accommodation, and then getting more of them.
And when did it start to turn to, you know, some light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, by I want to say July, August, we were back up to 80% occupancy. And so pretty quickly, actually, the results of our intensive data science, product, sales, marketing efforts were working pretty quickly. I mean, even then, our what we call our length of stay, which is how long people stay, was substantially different. So prior to COVID, our length of stay was like 3 or 4 days. By like June, it was like 30 days, right? Because like people were just not moving around. They needed places to stay, but they weren't coming for the weekend, obviously. And so by July, we were monetizing our units. I would say that by the end of the year, by November, December, was when we started to see the same kind of weekend warriors that I mentioned before coming, and that continues today. And actually, my litmus test for whether Mexico City tourism is picking up is a percentage of conversations I hear in English on Amsterdam.
And what would the biggest lesson learned or thing that maybe made the company stronger that happened over, say, the last year of COVID?
A thing that we did, which was just a great muscle for us to build, was really, really rapid agility, right? So like, you know, it's always said like, oh, be super agile as a startup, but like we really had to be agile, and we're crunching data, making decisions on a day-to-day basis. And you know, we had this 5 p.m. meeting where people from product, data science, sales, marketing would sit and say, what were your learnings for the day? What are we going to do to change and adapt to that data for tomorrow? And that was just a net positive, you know, cultural shift for us to have. And so I think for us, again, like after we got past the kind of like we're crying about our situation phase, it was very much like, let's put our arms around this and like, you know, yeah, life sucks, but we have no choice but to get more of like who we're seeing.
If you could go back to when you were first moving to San Francisco, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
I would say I'm gonna tell you advice that I was given that has turned out to be really true, which is that as an entrepreneur, the highs are not as high as you think they are, and the lows are not as low as you think they are. I think if you truly go on the roller coaster ride of emotions that entrepreneurship gives you, you will go insane. And so in some ways, the kind of emotional job of an entrepreneur is to modulate those highs and lows to make the emotional state more sustainable. And someone told me that as soon as I was starting Kasai, and that has totally turned out to be true. And obviously you have to celebrate your wins, but not going as low as you think you are in the moment has been very helpful for the sustainability of this job.
Do you have any strategies that you use that other entrepreneurs, maybe a couple of years behind you in the journey, might benefit from for modulating those highs and lows?
Mona Shees for my birthday gave me a subscription to Headspace, which I am very, very happy about. And also one thing that I have been doing almost, sadistically is reading stories like, Adam Newman of the Theranos stories, to see, how did things go so awry, right? Because there is a very fine line between having the big, ambitious, like audacious goal that you have to tell in pitches to show your $10 billion TAM versus, like egomaniacal fraud, right? Like that line is like scarily blurry. And so understanding how these people went so far off the path has been really both like cathartic for me and also like has been just a great kind of decompress from like the pressures that I'm feeling like, well, things are bad, but they're not that bad. And so that helps to put things in perspective.
I think that's really smart. I did a deep dive on a bunch of different frauds a few years ago. Just interesting to see what happens and like why. And
right,
it's like very, very, very few people start out saying, I'm gonna commit fraud and I'm gonna build this fake empire and just steal money. Very, very few people do that. It's almost always, well, we missed our numbers here and we need to have this big presentation, so we're going to fake it till we make it. And then, it compounds over 5 years, and then you have, Madoff, or you have Theranos.
Totally. And when you're starting, that's what you have to do. You have to fake it till you make it, right? Like when we had just a couple of units and we're trying to talk to the biggest real estate developers in Mexico City. We didn't lie, but we did say like, oh, we are like, the hottest new like hospitality brand. And for sure we can operate your, 50 unit property, right? And that's a crazy thing to say. And so like the line between that kind of faking it till you make it versus having, drawing blood in Walgreens that you can't have good data on, like what is that line? And as I mentioned, it's like scarily blurry.
Do you have any books, blogs, podcasts, or documentaries you like to recommend to people? It could be about startups or just life in general.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the one that Angela, my investor from A16Z, recommended to me that I'm reading now is $1 Billion Loser about Adam Newman. Which I am just the most obsessed with because again, like it's easy to say in hindsight, like, oh, this is crazy, but actually the book is well written in that it like it takes you through the journey of like how things really started going south. And so I really enjoy that. And to kind of generalize, one thing that I really like to do, again, because I didn't do an MBA, is look at companies that I really admire and find the like HBS case study about it. That I actually learn a lot from those like 15-minute snippets, and it's also much more digestible than a 300-page book.
What's next for Kasai over the next year or two?
There are so many things that we can do once people start traveling again, which is happening. We just recently launched in beach destinations, or leisure destinations. So both beach, so like Punta Mita and Tulum and Puerto Vallarta, and also non-beach leisure destinations like Valle de Bravo. And that was very much something that we did in response to COVID, and that's working very well. And so I can see Kasai expanding to all of the kind of major Latin American cities, in addition to all of the major leisure destinations of the region. And then also one thing that we've done in that expansion is Kasai for the first couple of years was very focused on, a 2-bedroom in Condesa, right? So a very specific kind of property, whereas now we have a 6-bedroom villa in Puerto Vallarta. And so we're also looking at different kinds of offerings for our guests, and that's been very exciting. And so my ambition with Kasai is to build an iconic consumer brand in hospitality, and I think that can go in many ways. And for us over the next couple of years, that's geographic expansion and product line expansion.
Well, it's going to be great to see you continue to execute in LATAM. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for doing it.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with our guest, Nico Barawid. And thank you to Angel and Raka for producing this podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. It's the best way to share what's going on in Latin America's ecosystem.